It's not like he could climb a ladder and get out on his own, even if I wasn't entirely sure how he'd gotten down there in the first place. Summoning what little bravery I had left, I called out and broke the silence, something which felt like a terrible taboo in that god-awful place, like screaming in a graveyard. "Ripley!" I waited and hoped to hell I'd hear the pitter-patter of his paws, but for the longest of moments there was only the kind of silence that makes you wonder if someone or something in the darkness is holding its breath, trying to look like just another patch of nothing, biding its time until you finally turn around and show it your back. The TV came on with a blurt of white noise that was so loud and so sudden I cried, threw my arms up, and nearly fell backwards onto a rolled-out sleeping bag that looked like it had spent a week in the sewer. By the time I realized what had caused the noise, I could already hear a tinny rendition of Daniel Vance's voice. I realized the issue here. I need to emphasize just how little I understand anything that's. I frowned at the screen as I approached. It showed a greenish infrared view of the bunker with Daniel up front and the dinner table behind him. It was grainy and hard to see, but I could clearly tell that his family were sitting in those chairs. Miranda was first to fall ill. Looking back, it makes perfect sense. Miranda often went into storage to fetch food for cooking, and we found it behind one of the refrigerators. So that's shit. One of the figures in the background slumped onto the table with a loud clank and sent a plate spinning off onto the ground. "Shit, shit, shit," Daniel muttered as he got up and grabbed the woman by the shoulders and sat her upright. "Miranda never did like my cooking." He snorted a laugh as he fussed with something at the back of the chair. "The rods are much better than tape. All those hours spent taping them upright to the chairs never worked. But the rods, they fit right into the spine, and with a little modification I can just slot them into the chairs. That way everyone is able to join in for dinner. I'm working on something similar for family game night." Daniel wandered over to the camera, and with a grin he lifted it from the tripod and scanned the dinner table. What I saw nearly made me drop my torch. His family were long dead. Gaunt faces. Missing noses. Lips that had receded to reveal awful grins. These were corpses, plain as day, even when viewed through such a low-resolution image. The only thing that made them seem remotely alive was the way their eyes still reflected the infrared back so that they glowed in the dark. And yet Daniel seemed oblivious to it all. He tousled Elliot's hair. Kissed his wife on the cheek. Run a hand across one young girl's shoulder. He even picked the young Alexander up from his high chair, and I assume he coddled him. I don't know for sure because I looked away, unwilling to see the poor boy up close. Eyes averted from the screen, I couldn't help but pan my torch across to that same dinner table and shiver as I finally realized what all those stains were. Not quite blood, but close. Liquefying flesh. Left alone for months, Daniel had not put his family's bodies to rest. Instead, he had moved them around from place to place and puppeted them, living life as if nothing had really changed. Looking at where those stains had settled, I saw a clear pattern emerge. He had put them to bed. He had set them dinner. He had propped them up to watch TV, or gave them their favorite books. They even sat there as lifeless husks while Daniel waited for them complete a fucking jigsaw. The idea horrified me to my core. Back to work. It's obviously not part of the original designs. No room on the other side, not on the blueprints. Elliot didn't believe me, and why would he? I made every inch of this place, but I did not install that door in storage on the bottom level. I checked the cameras and some of the photos I took during the build, and the wall is just blank. But the door is there now, and it must lead somewhere. I don't know when or why it opens, but it does, and the next time I'll be ready. Because I have to know what's on the other side, and why it did this to us. Alone down here, often all asleep at once. Anything could have slit our throats and been done with it. But it didn't. It took its time, and I have to know why. It took our radios and computers and phones. One by one. None of us noticing until it was far too late. I kept telling the kids they needed to take better care of their things, and even as they complained, I just assumed the phones were lying behind some shelf. Where else could they go in a locked bunker? But it wasn't the children at all. Looking back, there are so many signs. Who kept taking away the lights? Who kept draining the batteries in our torches? How long did we live with it before we finally realized we weren't alone? Was it here every step of the way? A door out of nothing that leads to nowhere, at least most of the time. Because I know for a fact it does not always open onto a blank wall. There is something behind it. I can hear it shuffling around in there, wet breath rattling in its lungs, a horrible sound I hear roaming these halls when it thinks I'm asleep. I listen to Daniel, fascinated by this strangely compelling rant, when movement caught my eye. An infrared camera running in the dark, its image a roiling mess of uniform noise. What was it I'd seen? I paused the tape and rewound. Squinting, I saw 2 pinpricks of light in the darkness just over Daniel's shoulder. Slowly, the image resolved itself in my mind. I knew what I was seeing, and it turned my blood to ice. Miranda Vance had turned her head, and her lifeless eyes glowed as she fixed them on the back of Daniel's head. Not even any point leaving at this stage. I'm no doctor, but that door is giving off enough radiation to kill a family of 7. If none of us had touched it. Being in the same room is risky, but not lethal. But given how sick we've become, it's pretty obvious our curiosity got the better of us, one by one, and we all got too close. Or maybe not. Maybe that thing on the other side came through and did this. I don't even can. Wait, what was that? Daniel turned and the camera stopped recording. The image it froze on was of a lone man, bright as a star in the camera's lens, facing off against unknowable darkness broken only by 6 pairs of white, glowing eyes. I became painfully aware of my position relative to the table, and I had the painful premonition that if I turned, those chairs would not be empty. I would see the Vances, all of them, Daniel as well, waiting for me. Heads turned. Bodies left to rot for years in the dark. Behind me something shifted. It breathed. Loud. Quick. I knew what it was. I knew. It came at me so fast that when I felt something hot and wet touch my hand I screamed, only for the presence to suddenly recoil. But then, without hesitation, it leapt at me and bore me to the ground. I wept as Ripley licked my face. He was shivering and, worst of all, silent, which was not normal. He was not a quiet dog, not when greeting me and not when excited like he was now. But whatever he'd seen down here, he clung to me and dug his paws into my shoulders like he wanted to be cradled over the shoulder, something he has been too big to do for years. "Oh, you fucking idiot," I cooed in a soft whisper, and even in the dark I could feel his tail wagging. Joking aside, I felt nothing but relief at finding him. "Let's get the hell out of here." I picked him up, straining a little under the weight, but refusing to give in to tired muscles, and made for the ladder. It wasn't easy climbing the 3 or 4 rungs to the hatch, but I managed it and gave the hatch a shove. First one hand, then 2. Again and again, with everything I had, but still that hatch refused to budge. Shit. I cried while pounding at it with my fists, but all I achieved was a sore wrist. The hatch had jammed when, somehow, the handle had been snapped clean off. Now I'd need a pair of pliers or something to cut through the metal bar locking it shut. My fingers couldn't move it, nor could I brute force the hatch open. The metal bar was an inch thick and, at the very least, I'd need some tools to get at it from this side. At least it's fixable, I thought as I climbed back down and caught my breath. On one wall I noticed a simple diagram of the bunker made in chalk. It had 3 floors. The bottom was storage, Daniel had mentioned that before, and I noticed that he had drawn through it with a large red X, and the top floor was labeled quarters, where I stood now. But the middle floor was labeled workshops, and it was there I realized that I'd find what I needed. There was one door that opened onto a concrete stairwell and, standing at the top, I shone my light down the spiraling guard rails, unsure of what it was I hoped to see. There were only harsh shadows and the sense of something foul rising up on the air. A smell that tickled my throat and burned a little in my lungs. Had the police even gone down this far? Had they seen what I'd seen on that TV and just left? Somehow I thought it was unlikely that it had been enough to send the entire sheriff's department running, so was it something else that had done it? Something that had been enough to terrify dozens of armed men. Something that was almost definitely down there. The door. I went down quietly. At first I considered leaving Ripley behind, but after losing him the first time I decided I'd rather risk it just to know that he was right next to me. Besides, he was being quieter than I was, and I didn't feel much like going down those stairs on my own. He accompanied me with only the quiet click-clack of his paws on concrete, a sound I found deeply comforting as I barely managed to keep my torch from shaking in my hand and my breathing steady. Down one floor and I found the workshop exactly as you might expect. A large space filled with generators and fuel and water tanks and boilers and heaters and pretty much anything and everything that you'd need to survive, but which you couldn't put outside due to fallout. Wires, pipes, and tubes ran from one end of the room to the other, and even years later, most of the machinery still hummed in the pitch-black emptiness, an idea I found deeply unsettling. Taking one look at that strange tangle of harsh shapes and industrial figures looming out of the walls and floor, I shivered and looked around, quickly finding a small area Daniel had cordoned off for his own use. About a fifth of the total floor space, there was a large workbench and some seriously high-end machining equipment, all very well used. Lathes, buzzsaws, drills, belt sanders, welding torches. Everything a man needed to do it himself, and Daniel had been busy. I'm not sure exactly what it was he'd been working, but there was an arm on the bench. It sat atop a pile of papers that had slowly turned brown over the years until the whole thing looked like it had been soaked in tobacco spit. On the whiteboard was a faded but still visible diagram of what looked to me like a ball-and-socket joint. I thought of the tape, of Daniel's little mechanism to keep his family upright, and then looked at the arm and suppressed a momentary gag reflex. I don't know if Dan had been working on posable limbs, or just a way to put the decomposing remains back together after they'd started to fall apart, but the size of the arm suggested a preteen child, and he'd left it out on the surface like it was a disassembled clock. It was also missing a finger. Just how fucking crazy was he? I wondered as I pinched my nose with one hand and began overturning boxes looking for a hefty pair of pliers, or maybe a hacksaw. Ripley backed away from the noise, but once I made sure he wasn't going anywhere, I carried on grabbing and pulling at box after box, hoping I'd find what I was looking for. Anything to break that fucking metal bar. In the end, I managed to get a pair of bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty pair of pliers. One went in my pocket, one went down the back of my jeans, and the other was clutched in my fist, too large to be tucked away in my clothes. The bolt cutters felt hefty in my hand, which was a bit of comfort, but that feeling didn't last long. Something moved in the darkness, out there in the twisted jungle of shadows cast by all those pipes and wires that ran from one machine to the next. A figure moved. Thin, but unmistakably human in its outline. I couldn't help but remember what I'd seen on that tape. Surely it couldn't have been real? Maybe Daniel had rigged something up. Some fishing wire and a motor, maybe? The idea that those bodies had been moving on their own. I couldn't be sure of that, could I? It was a frightening idea, one my mind had latched onto out of sheer panic. That was all, and then I saw them. A pair of white pinpricks reflecting back at me from the depths of that cluttered room. Ripley, already behind me, head nuzzled into my leg, pushed even closer against me, and let out a barely audible whine under his breath. The behavior of a dog who was terrified, close to pissing himself with fear. Just a bit of metal, I told myself as the light shook so violently in my hand I struggled to see straight. Just two shiny bits of metal. They blinked and began to come towards me. If I had any doubts left, they were dispersed by the sight of a pale white hand emerging into the light. I ran straight to the stairs and went to climb them, but only 1 or 2 steps in and I saw something